years as a pop star, fame and fortune take second place to his profound spiritual beliefs. I asked him whether meeting stars can really give children a boost.
Well, I think anybody that can alleviate the suffering, and well, even meeting people doesn't alleviate suffering, but certainly alleviate the kind of lifestyles that people who have terminal illnesses have got to cope with, knowing that there is a period of time left and that they're going to leave this earth. Anything that we can do, as you're doing, to alleviate that side of their life so that their lives can in fact have some kind of feeling and emotion, I mean, I just think it's wonderful that that can happen.
Margaret, many of the children that you've helped have actually died from their illnesses. How do children come to terms with the idea of death?
Generally, very well, which surprises me. A lot of them accept it. A little girl called Louise died the other day. She had leukemia, and she said to her parents, I fought and fought, and I'm sorry, Mummy and Daddy, I just can't fight anymore. And she hadn't been baptised, and she said that she'd had this message from God that she should be baptised. So her parents got her baptised, she became Catholic, and she was quite, well, I wouldn't say happy to die, but she'd accepted it. And just before she died, she'd been unconscious for about 36 hours, and her family all with her mum, dad, sister, grandparents. And she was asleep, and she just suddenly sat up and she said, Mummy, can you get the priest, please? So her mother said, yes, darling. So she phoned the priest. He came round very quickly, and she said, can we all say the Lord's Prayer together? So the priest said Lord's Prayer, and she said, thank you, and she looked out the window and smiled and said, I'm coming, and she just died. Now, that's the second time I've had that experience with a child.
You know, my question is to the parents and the people left. If someone in that condition can have that experience and they've all witnessed it firsthand, how can they possibly hold themselves away from God's love? Children have a natural instinct, and I really do believe that the supernatural, which is what God lives in, actually does filter down into people's lives. I read a book called Margaret, about a young girl who had cancer, and her whole being was filled with Christ. And she said, although it was terrible pain for her and suffering, and she did die, her whole reason, it seemed, for living there was to let other people know that it was not such a terrible thing after all. And she knew that God had her in her care. And I think stories like that, Margaret, are fantastic. How is it, as adults, we can witness this kind of thing that you're talking about, and her parents who obviously loved her? How do we hold away from God? And why do we blame him if anything does go wrong? She wasn't going to blame him, obviously. She just said, wait for me, I'm coming.
And have you heard of other similar kinds of experiences from other children that you've helped?
The little boy, well, I said little boy, he was 18, bless him, but he wasn't very big in size. Just before he died, again, he'd been asleep, and he said to his mother, can you get the Bible and turn to book, I'm not sure what book it was, verse such and such, and just read it to me. So she said, yes, darling, and she sat and read it and held his hand, and he just smiled and he said, thanks, Mum. And he just lay back and went to sleep, and he never woke up. So he had a premonition he was being called. And then another story I heard the other day, which is just quite incredible. A little girl that was in the same hospital as Louise, when Louise was so ill, had relapsed at the same time as Louise, but there was no way she knew Louise had relapsed, and there was no way she knew that Louise had died. Absolutely no way. And the morning before she died, she said, words to the effect that Louise had come down and told her that she'd died, and Jesus had sent her down to collect her. And she died that night.
Well, stories like that are absolutely extraordinary, but I wonder, Cliff, the usual accusation that's levelled against anyone who has any kind of Christian belief is, how on earth can a loving God allow that kind of suffering to happen to young children?
Well, I mean, I think it's an easy opt-out, actually, to blame God for something like that, because as much as I believe that there is a God, I also believe that there is this evil force, and that he is out to maim and hurt and turn people away from God as often as he can. Now, if you take children, some of the best ways of damaging people is to damage what they love most. And therefore, children are damaged, and I believe... Some people will look at me and say, oh, that's an oversimplification of the fact. But the fact is that sometimes people who blame God don't even believe he exists. If there is no God, and let's assume that there is no God, what I'd like to throw back to people is say, how do you deal with someone suffering? No, forget about God. If there's no God, then you've still got to deal with it. The suffering is there. I personally believe that God does care for every one of those children, and that they seem to have this natural feeling that God does care for them. It's up to us to have a positive approach to their deaths. I mean, you were saying about Louise, that her parents are now believing parents. Her death, which will be a tragedy in their life all the time, can be seen in a positive light in that they, having now received God into their lives, is in the same world as their daughters. They just have to wait a little bit longer maybe to get there, but it's going to be there.
Well, obviously, Margaret, not all the children that you help do die from their illnesses. I wonder if in some way what you do to help them by introducing them to their favourite stars gives them some kind of burst and drive to carry on fighting.
Yes, one little girl we took to the Montreux Pop Festival, not last May, the May before. She had 2 months to live with cancer, and she had a wonderful time out in Montreux. All the stars, specifically Tears for Fears, which are her heroes, gave her a wonderful time, and, you know, she's fine now, touch wood, bless her. And another child that, well, nobody quite knew what was wrong with her. She had lots of pain, and she'd lost weight, and she just was very, very depressed, and they'd got to start steroid treatment or something like that on her. And the doctor said, you know, can you take her to Montreux to boost her spirits before we start this treatment? So I said, yes, sure. And this little thing came along all skinny and all depressed and miserable. And within 3 days, she was the life and soul of the party. And to this day, she's never had that treatment.
So could you explain that spiritually in terms of it being a kind of boost of faith that can actually almost bring about healing in itself?
Oh, faith can, but what you're talking about, I think, you see, everyone forgets that we're not just material. We're not just physical beings, we're also spiritual, and sometimes the two go together. But in the case of young children, for instance, where sometimes the mind, there needs to be a motivation to go on fighting, as they say. So that if you can, in fact, bring joy into their lives and suddenly, hey, wait a minute, life is great, let's grab a hold of it. I mean, we know full well that many times the mind over the matter business works, particularly in ailments. And so therefore it doesn't surprise me at all that when their mental attitude is changed and brought into a kind of positive bloom, it fights whatever's wrong in the body, and the body kills whatever is killing it. And so I'm not surprised at all at that. But of course, I do believe, you see, there are still miracles happening within the Christian world. You'll read about, I know of people who have been cured of all sorts of things, because God is alive and He is doing it. And the world's going to have to accept it whether they like it or not. It does happen. And of course, the spirituality in someone's life, even if it doesn't make them live any longer, will give them a quality of life that will be perfect right through to their death.